And greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Humanities in Action virtual seminar series brought to you by the Faculty of Humanities and Education at the University of the West Indies, Mona campus. Under the theme, Black Lives Matter, the historical quest to respect black bodies and black lives. For decades, academics, activists, and people alike have sought to gain this respect for black lives without any comparison, without having to qualify, without having to worry about someone else shouting, all lives matter. And even before the very invention of the hashtag, we have been fighting this fight. And this is our contribution to the struggle. And we definitely hope and pray and seek that change that we all want to see, not just in Jamaica, not just in the region, but globally. I am Steffon Campbell, and I'll be the moderator for this afternoon's seminar. And today we have a very esteemed guest, Dr. Stanley Griffin, right? And his presentation is under the title, Black Lives Always Matter, Historical Records and Caribbean Archives in the Fight for Black Humanity. And Dr. Stanley H. Griffin holds a BA with honors and in history and a PhD in cultural studies from the University of the West Indies, Mona campus. He also holds an MSc in archives and records management from the University of Dundee in Scotland. He's formerly the assistant archivist and later archivist in charge of the UE archives at the Mona campus. And he's now a lecturer in archival studies at the Mona campus in the Department of Library and Information Studies, where he coordinates the archives and records and management program. Stanley's research interests include multiculturalism in Antigua and the Eastern Caribbean, the cultural dynamic of intra-Caribbean migration, archives in the constructs of Caribbean culture, and community archives in the Caribbean. His most recent publication includes The Decolonization of the Caribbean Record and Archives Reader. So without further ado, Dr. Stanley Griffin.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Mr. Campbell, for this quite an introduction. I trust that I'll, hopefully meet up with your expectations. But I really hope this afternoon to share with you on the perspective of information studies and archives and how our documentary heritage has helped to, be a vanguard in the fight for black humanity. So there are four things I want to do this afternoon, and four things I hope to cover. One, using the 2020 Black Lives Matter movement, we want to reflect on the following. Consider how information studies and the role of archival studies in particular can, move the discussion and the movement along. Secondly, describe the ways historical records in Caribbean and of Caribbean slave society detail the efforts to define blackness, even though they attempted to dehumanize black African laborers who were enslaved. Thirdly, I want to illustrate the ways in which blacks themselves resisted those efforts, and in doing so defined their humanity and documented their own stories. And finally, I want to show how we in the present day can document and continue to fight for black humanity and the role that Caribbean archival institutions can play in preserving our expressions of blackness. So, the Black Lives Matter movement started really in 2013. As you rightly said in your introduction, it's been another experience. And coming out of the Trayvon Martin's murder and the acquittal of the murderer, the Black Lives Matter movement started with a mission to eradicate white supremacy and build local power to intervene in violence inflicted on black communities by the state and vigilantes. And, for the betterment of black lives generally. And so the George Floyd's, murder, quite frankly, ignited a wave of, for me it was like yet another hashtag, yet another experience, yet another death and life lost. And it ignited not just a nationally within the USA dynamic, but a global protest, which was, I mean, when places like Afghanistan, putting up murals, it's serious business around the world. And it has really triggered lots of discussions and changes as it relates to symbols of racism and other forms of oppressions, from flags to statues. And we're going to talk about those expressions, what I will call in this discussion expressions of memory, and how the fight for humanity is much more than what meets the eye. It's systematic. It goes all the way down into very granular activities, very granular day-to-day movements, actions, and so forth. And so I hope to use the Black Lives Matter movement and the issues that are present today to go back, to come forward, and hopefully to go future. Because quite frankly, when you go into the archives, that's exactly what you're doing. You're going all the way back into time with the hope that whatever you discover, quote unquote, and whatever you learn, what experiences you will get a taste of in going back, will help to shape your present and better your future. So the first thing, we're going to talk about information studies. People don't really understand what's information studies, right? And people think, I've been called a glorified file clerk, right? So there's much more to filing than archival studies. There's much more to shelves and books in library studies. There's much more to dealing with dusty stuff from the archaeologists in museum studies. And we're going to think about information studies as an academic discipline. So information studies is really about the way persons, organizations, and societies organize, create, use, maintain, disseminate, and preserve their information. It's an interdisciplinary domain concerned with all those 5 aspects, and in each section of those, in each discipline, we deal with creating, using, maintaining, and disseminating, and preserving information in different aspects. And we're going to talk about how that plays itself out. So we're definitely into cultural heritage. We're definitely into the working and dealing with the byproducts and products of human life, human creation, human activity. That mug, that coffee mug, is indeed an artifact. As much as, my notebook here can be an artifact. And it speaks to my own mindset and so forth. So we're going to talk about those things as we move along from information studies. Information studies then is one domain with at least four. And at our department, we are concentrating on these 4 disciplinary professions. They are academic disciplines, ways of thinking about these issues, and it will lead to professions. So those who would come out of our archival studies will be qualified as archivists. Those who come out of our archives and records management program will perform the work of a records manager. Those who do our museum studies will be curators either for galleries and museums, and our library studies program will definitely produce librarians. All right? And there, we can mix and match and so forth. Persons have that opportunity, but there are distinct disciplines. And our focus in our department is on the Caribbean, obviously. We spend a lot of time thinking about the place where many people vacation. And so we're thinking about archival studies in particular. I'm an archivist and an archival educator now. And so I want to think about my discipline and how it can contribute to Black Lives Matter. In archival studies, we think about 3 things mainly. What are records? What is record-keeping systems? Or what are record-keeping systems? And more so, how do people do memory? How do people remember? All right? And so we're going to start off with some definitions. Record generally is information created, received, and maintained as evidence. Information created, received as evidence by an organization or a person, as part of their legal obligations, as part of their business transactions, as part of their relationships, right? Usually we think of archival material as in paper format, even though the technology has changed and we do have digital electronic formats, but it is really proof of some activity taking place. You can't have an archival record without some activity taking place. Something has had to happen for it to become evidence of. And more importantly, hence it's highlighted. And throughout the talk, you'll find that there will be text highlighted. And I would hope it will draw your attention, and it will, for the duration of the talk, keep it at the back of your heads, right? So, an archival record has arguably fixed medium, It is fixed, it is tangible, you can't change it. But more importantly, it has content. It is about something. It is speaking to something. It has context. It was created within a story, within a transaction, within a relationship, within an activity. But more importantly, it has structure. A receipt from juicy beef patties here in Jamaica must look a particular way for you to pay your money, get your Jamaican patty for you to consume. For that receipt to be evidence of that transaction. And so when we move, as we go throughout the talk, I want us to keep at the back of our heads that each activity created a record, which will have a particular shape, which will have a particular look, which will have a particular field. And more importantly, it's about memory. An archival record is supposed to trigger something. One theorist says we're doomed, we're wired to remember. And since we can't remember everything, we fix our memory onto particular things, whether places, whether aromas, and so forth. And so our archival record is about that extension of memory, and more importantly, especially within a business context. And like how we're talking, lots of corruption in terms of politics. We refer to records for demonstrating accountability. So you will find records all over. Everybody have a record at the house. Everybody has to create a record. And in fact, from the time you're born, if you live in a state, right, you have records. And your records will continue to grow and accumulate until, God forbid, knock on wood, you die. And so the diary in your attic, the manuscript of a novel, your letters, your official government documents, your files, all of those things will constitute as records. Your maps, plans, your selfies, right? Photographs, all will constitute as records. But for today, usually an archival record has to be appraised. It has to be considered and weighed as to its value. And it must, after being tested, it must have continuing, or another theorist says, enduring value. It transcends the evidence that it is speaking to, and it speaks to other things. You have to keep it around because of its importance to the organization, its importance to your own life, and its importance to the society. But for our discussion this afternoon, we're looking at historical records. Historical records. Historical records. I lost my camera. Historical records. People, hello. Historical records are ones that have survived over time. They may not necessarily have been appraised as having archival value, but because they were retained for the purposes of business and whatever transaction as evidence of the time, they have survived the time. They were kept enough, and still they are used for the purposes of interpreting and the writing of history. And so the records that I will be referring to this afternoon will be classified as historical records. If I could get my screen back, hopefully. So we have content, context, and structure. Records that are used to speak to and hopefully extend memory. It is back to demonstrate accountability. We appraise records for their value. The highest appraisal one record could ever strive to get in its lifetime is that of enduring value. The lowest ones will be obviously destroyed. And we use these things to promote and to prolong our memory. A record-keeping system, records are created within a record-keeping system. Now, this might be kind of technical, but don't get technical right now because it's really about a framework, that context. It's about a coordinated process to ensure that the records are collected, organized, categorized, so managed. And within this framework, there will be records. Another theory, the basic definition is records are really byproducts. You don't go out and create a record, but by your activity. When you went and buy lunch, you never went and create a receipt. You bought lunch, and as part of buying lunch, you get a receipt. That is a byproduct of your activity. It will need parties. A receipt is a meeting of the mind, and it passes from one hand to the other. So a record-keeping system requires people, it requires a process, It requires tools, equipment, software, used to capture, organize, and so on. And now broadly, think of what you do at home, how you create records at, in your businesses with those 4 components in mind. And as we think more generally, I want you not to be too technical. It's not an archival studies class, but I really want you to appreciate that records don't just happen. There's a framework to this thing, right? And there's a context to it. And thirdly, in archival studies, we spend a lot of time thinking about what are people remembering, how do people remember, what details are they remembering. I remember as an undergrad, we had oral history, an oral history project. And the privilege was mine to interview a Barbadian nurse who returned from the UK, having spent her life, the usual migrant story. And she, talked about the day she moved into the house that they purchased. She moved into the house that they purchased, the family purchased, on the day President Kennedy was assassinated. We always tie our memories to a greater global, a greater activity. For her family, what was happening in the USA, well, she was in the UK. President got assassinated, she moved into her house. One separate activities, but it is tied and fixed in her memory by those. So that is what we spend a lot of our time thinking about. And for the purposes of our discussion this afternoon, I've added a fourth point, the dynamics and expressions of that knowledge of the past. How do we act out on that memory? We act out on that memory by our monuments, our statues, the way we dance, the way we create our music, or food, or landscapes, or built environment. We could go on and on. Our cultural heritage. In other words, and we're going to talk about it, licking down Columbus is not the answer. It has to go deeper than that. Right? It is the answer, but it has to go deeper than that. All right. So here we are. If I were to, graphically show all that theory in one, you have records at the ground level, the granular level, the basic level. Records are created through that record-keeping system. Out of that record-keeping system comes the memory. And finally, what we see on the roadside are the expressions of memory. And so, bear in mind, and keep this image at the back of your heads, because we'll be going back to it as we go throughout the talk, where the expressions of memory are reflecting the records, and the records speak to those expressions of memory. There's a system in place and at play between monuments and records. Now in the Caribbean, records and archives, form part of governance. You'll find archives is tied to this concept of administration. So, especially government administration. And so the history of record creation and record use and maintenance is really linked to the history of the Caribbean, right? You can't talk about archives without having a full appreciation of history, and particular histories in particular, especially. And so records were created to substantiate. They were created to substantiate the production of the individual plantations, and we're going to talk about that, and to give evidence to the assets on the ground, especially the enslaved. And so if you look at the image, I'm using the text that a prominent archival practitioner, Mandy Banton from the National Archives UK, where she looked at the records of the Colonial Office and showed how the records of the Colonial Office was this hub between each territory. And so we in the Caribbean had no relationship with each other. Our relationship was between the Colonial Office and the Crown. Each unit of activity on the plantation had a direct reporting relationship to a sponsor in the UK, in the UK or Europe. All right? Back in them slave days, there was no money on the ground. Everything that was, it was a barter system like. I send raw materials, you send this. And so you'll find records or historical records speaking to that relationship. Records were part of colonial control. The only way you could ensure that the sun never set on the Union Jack was to have a system in place where, you ensure that the sun never set on the Union Jack around the world. And part of that control was, by having those details, and we're thinking about records in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, there was no email, no ships. And so that 6 months, 3 months time frame, it had to be detailed enough for you to sit down in your colonial office in the UK and understand and know what's going on really here in the Caribbean. But finally, records were used to validate and celebrate dominance. Those who have records about themselves, there's a sense, we had an instance in Jamaica recently where this guy wanted to become a soldier, you'll remember, and he had no birth certification, he had no TR and tax registration number. The poor fellow couldn't get anywhere in life within our structure of society because he had no records. Those who are, and so it's established, a company that has good record-keeping systems, strong record-keeping cultures, have a strong loyalty with customers. I tell students all the time, why we all love Kentucky Fried Chicken is because we are aware of the standards of it. And there's an archive somewhere with the recipe. And the details will come from the archives around the world, so everybody cooking the same thing. Same thing with Coca-Cola, same thing with Levi Jeans, same thing with all those larger companies that we have an affinity to. It boils down, those activities trickle all the way down to the records. And so we keep records because they help to validate identity. Art, literature, museums, libraries, and archives all help to create a sense of identity, especially for marginalized groups, when they are able to participate in these forms of, of documented and symbolic recognition. Archives will connect, right, one to the other. And so we ought not to think of archival records, historical records, as just appearing out of nowhere. They were created by individuals and organizations and used to support their values and missions. Records will never counter what the creator had in mind. Records will never counter what the creator had in mind. I feel like I'm teaching a class. Records will never counter what the creator had in mind. It can't change. They're a byproduct of your activity, and it will reflect your mindset. All right? And so, as Randall Jimison says, archives are a constructed memory. These texts and documents reflect particular perspectives and are used to contest for power to interpret societies, both past and present. Therefore, archival records are a major player in this business of identity construction and politics. Eric Ketelaar says archives is really about remembering. As I said before, we select what we should and should not be kept, right? And so what the archivist remembers, what the archivist selects for long-term retention, long-term memory, chances are society will remember. What the archivist forgets will be forgotten by society. And if you read what is selected for remembering via our archival process called appraisal, is kept, preserved. So there's a process that leads from deciding that what we have here is of enduring value to our family or to our society. We don't keep rubbish, at least knowingly. And those who keep, that's why we're not, archival people are not hoarders. There's a reason why we keep things. And usually they have enduring value. And so what is destroyed, chances are, will be forgotten. So the second aim this afternoon is to talk about how historical records of the Caribbean slave society help to define. And here we have Professor Welch, formerly of Cave Hill, at work using an archival record from the Barbados Department of Archives. And so I love this little poem because it actually describes the priorities of colonial society in a very clear, easy, primary schoolish kind of way. It was all about sugar, molasses, and rum, till your ears are confounded, your senses struck dumb, And the pen keeper joins in his innocent prattle about pastures and fences and cattle. If you understand what that poem is trying to say, black lives had no business in that. We were just part of the process. The real objectives in the Caribbean was about sugar, molasses, and rum. And the pen keeper, it was about land and access to the wealth in the land. And so pastures, fences, and cattle, the division of the land, the changing of the landscapes for the purposes of extracting what was referred to as bullion for colonialism and mercantilism, protecting on trade and showing off over the other European powers that we have the most and we're wealthiest because of. Black human lives was not a part of the equation. It was never considered. And so I want you to fix in your minds this image for a few seconds, because each activity there literally took place and still has implications for us today. So you're finding a group, men and women, cutting cane, children and the elderly, if you could see clearly, picking up cane trash. There's the overseer or the plantation owner, referred to sometimes as the plantocrat on the horse, talking to perhaps a middleman there. You're seeing the tradesmen, you're seeing over in the back end, you're seeing the windmill. There's the entire setup of Caribbean plantation in this one image. And I love this quotation from Dr. Carl Watson, is 2003 publication, where he says, the Negro, an enslaved person, stated the following: the devil was in the Englishman. He made everything work. He made the Negro work, the horse work, the donkey work, the wood work, water work. The entire environment, the entire Caribbean was placed within this plantation domain and made to produce. And for each activity that would have taken place, there was a record about it. Nothing took place. I mean, even we have diaries by Thomas Thistlewood and his very scandalous behaviors. Even that was documented. All right, so, the types of historical records that we now have and can be found in our national archives around the region and have been acknowledged and respected by UNESCO, member of the World International Registration Program, are the following: account ledgers, bills of sales, church records, conveyances, deeds and wills, diaries and memoirs, estate inventories, estate plans and land allotments, letters and correspondence, legal writs and licenses, records of legislature, military records, prints and paintings. And I want to stop at prints and paintings, because there's a painting right there. And so often, depending on the time period of the painting and the commissioner of the painter, who commissioned the painting, particular perspectives were portrayed. The harshness of the slave system, or the perceived, wonderful time of the enslaved in the slave system. And if you watch your news, recently there was a commissioner in the US in one particular state that had a problem with the discussion of slavery. Because as far as she knew, everybody got clothes and housing. It was a wonderful time. You just had to work, And so some of these perceptions that still are with us today come out of these historical records. Reports and logs, slave registers, and we're going to talk about slave registers as well, because slave registers were not like school class registers to ensure that you're around. It was a means of counting you up so we can get money. We paid for you to be here. Right? It's like how you do stock taking, quite frankly, and shipping records. So in all these records, black human lives were itemized, dehumanized, and objectified for the purposes of wealth creation for the metropolitan societies. Now, Campbell Brathwaite has this theory called creolization, right? It's kind of popular. And it describes the process in which, the whites kind of enforced and created a society or you know, an interaction on the plantation space, quite frankly, because it wasn't a national place, right? It was plantations on plantations. Each plantation was a domain in and of itself. And it was about the white yoking itself over the enslaved. And so, you know, that red line there is about the power dynamics taking place, where the whites, you know, trying to enforce their authority, enforce concepts of whiteness over blackness, purity, power, wealth over poverty, you know, servitude, and some of these issues, servitude to whites. Think of tourism, you know, still playing out in today. And society at that time was, again, very tense. You know, the slightest thing will trip a man off because of trying to maintain that power. And in terms of records, it played out in the way records were created, what was documented, and so forth. Diaries, plantation logs, slave registers, wills, blue books, and so forth helped to enforce that white over black domination. The blacks never take it just so. They resisted. And that resistance took the form of records as well. A lot of what we call cultural records, or songs, or calypsos, or dance, or rhythms, the way we dress, or stories, or languages, or rituals, or religious beliefs, the way we cook with food, form part of that resistance to this creolized, you know, hegemonic yoking that was taking place at the time. And we're going to talk about that, we're going to talk about that as we go further, right? So, archives was very much a part of the architecture of imperialism, right? The records are really sources of narrative, sources of stories, of power, where, you know, the blood and the bloodless beginnings of all Caribbean nations are stored, captured, and, you know, it's just there for our access. So the archives is a place of epistemological violence. It's a place where one way of knowing the world, the spoken, the oral tradition, the performative, what we now refer to as the cultural, was replaced with the written. And we still, if you think of our research methodologies at this time, up to now, we still think that if it is not written, it can't be triangulated, it can't be true, it can't be factual. It will change. And so we have a lack of respect, even though we recognize the cultural value to it. We lack the respect for the information value that will come out of these oral traditions and so forth. And so colonial history are, you know, is shaped by the archives. The archives reflect that history, and it's about, you know, asserting that empirical, scientific, quote-unquote, objective source of knowledge. And so if I only have 40 minutes, right? And if I were to discuss the ways in which defined records, historical records, define blackness and dehumanize, it will take all day. But I found, you know, reference to this letter written in 1645 by George to his cousin in the UK. And it says, "If you go to Barbados, you shall see a flourishing island, and many able men. I believe they bought this year no less than 1,000 Negroes, and the more they buy, the better able they are to buy. For in a year and a half they will earn, with God's blessing," note that, "as much as they cost. A man that will settle there in Barbados must look to," quote unquote, I have to take out some stuff, "procure, get himself some Negroes, the life of the place, for the increase of his own plantation." In other words, we get these types of letters are still being written today, right? Because we have a migration culture that still happens. And usually when the family write back, "Oh, things so wonderful, you know, things, money flowing," but there's usually a but. In this case, for wealth to be generated, you need slaves. 1645. And wealth generation was dependent on this controllable, you know, large controllable labor force. And the assets of stop taking your enslaved meant, you know, a symbolism of wealth, right? And so if we had time to deconstruct, because the whole idea of God blessing this thing, right, is also very problematic, at least in our understanding of society today. Hopefully we're now at slide 26, but when post-enslavement took place, well, post-emancipation, right, the concepts that dehumanized African slave was extended. And for the purposes of our conversation, we're going to talk about what happened to the East Indentured workers when they came to the Caribbean. I have a short excerpt from the film, Coolies, How Britain Reinvented Slavery. And before you press play, I want to say that while they were not forced into slavery, they signed contracts. The contracts were in English. Many didn't know English. Many didn't know where they were going, but they were hopping on a ship to go to around the British Empire. So thank you very much for pressing play at minute 6:50.
My name is David Dapperdine. Even though the name means very little to me, I know very little about the name. I teach literature at a university in Britain, the University of Warwick. And I've come to Guyana to look for the origins of my great-great-grandfather, who came from India in the 19th century, one of hundreds of thousands of people who went overseas to cut cane in the plantations. He's been totally lost in history. And I just want to discover something about this bareback, barefooted coolie who stepped off the planks, stepped off the Englishman's boat, and ended up on these shores. I've been told that in our national archives there are various lists of Indians in the plantation, birth certificates, etc. So I will just go through those as diligently as I can to try to trace this man. It'll be a needle in a haystack job, I suspect. I was looking for the first Aberdeen who came in 1855, yeah. And I don't know the date, you see. So I was hoping to find the date. I know the name of the ship. My mother told me it was the Apolline. If I look at June 1855, would it be later than June 1855? You don't think this would be it?
No, our registers would have the details, but our ship records don't go back to 55.
Where are the records? Do they exist?
No, I don't think so. My best bet is at the PRO though.
In London?
Yes. And then they're scattered, in various offices as well.
So that even if the records did exist, we wouldn't really necessarily know what location in Guyana,
yeah, exactly.
Or indeed in England they exist.
Or even
in villages throughout India, the British kept meticulous records as the Indians were recruited, gathered into holding depots, and registered.
There would have been, in all likelihood, ordinary peasant Indians. They would never, ever, ever have come across the sophistication of the British Empire, the bureaucratic sophistication of it, until they went to the depot to be certified as fit and healthy emigrants and to be validated by the British as potential emigrants. Certified that we have examined and passed the above-named woman as fit to emigrate, that she is free from all bodily and mental disease, and that she has been vaccinated since engaging to emigrate. There must have been a great moment of drama when they were asked to sign this piece of paper and having to press their thumb into the ink and press it on this piece of paper. Their first contact with paper, probably. There must have been some kind of excitement, perhaps, despair, but at least somebody's paying attention to them, to take their finger and press it on a piece of paper. They would not have understood what pressing their thumbs on a piece of paper meant, because they wouldn't have known that that was the equivalent of a signature. This piece of paper is all that remains of the life of this woman, and she's one There's hundreds in this book, banned book, hundreds, men, women, children. And this volume is one volume among 358, I believe, in this building alone. So you get a sense of how many Indians came. We know that about 239,000 people came from India to Guyana alone, never mind to Jamaica, to Barbados, the rest of the West Indies.
Very much. And so I want us to understand, and I find it very moving, each page representing a human life. Each page, each signature speaking of one person being shipped from home to the great unknown, to within a contractual situation that you really have no control over. And so this contract, and we're going to talk about this shortly, will become, as we saw for David Aberdeen, a genealogical record, a means of tracking. The record that was used to dehumanize, seeing them as stock, contracted labor, even though one theory says we want labor and we're getting people. Strange. This contract has, greater meaning. So, thanks for that. And so, in the third aim of this talk, I want to think about the ways in which blacks resisted. And blacks emphasized their humanity and documented their own narrative. And here we have an image of Campbell riots, the reenactment that takes place as part of the carnival set up in Trinidad. I rediscovered this thing from one of our students who wrote a research paper on how archival records are being used to re-energize the reenactments, right? And so, again, the records of colonialism still has day-to-day effect and impact on how we shape, how we do our festivals, and how we understand ourselves. So, blacks resisted and affirmed their humanity in four main ways. One, chances are you would know this, their resistance to the system of slavery. Them never just take it lying down. So the usual overt, rioting, rebellions, and so forth. The Haitian Revolution being the most prominent of them. And I really don't want to test my own memory by going through the 4 or 5 major ones that would have taken place over the years. But then there was a day-to-day covert. And as something keeps playing in the back of my head that just surviving another day within that system was resistance. Because that structure was not meant for you to survive, right? And so we had also, there was another form, maroonage, which is an image there of a maroon captain from the hills of Jamaica. And then there were other forms. The second one was one that comes from an article that I kind of fell in love with as an undergraduate history student by Sir Woodville Marshall of Cave Hill, We Be Wise to Many More Things. And in this article, he traces the hopes and expectations of the enslaved for their freedom in the post-emancipation period and beyond. And he did that using records. Now, some of the ambitions that they stated for themselves, they had for themselves, even though they were enslaved, are some of the things we take for granted today. Healthcare, access to education that is not religious-based, access to education that is geared away from agriculture. Not to say that, agricultural education is bad, but you have the option to. Back in the day, everything, preparing you for the plantation. And so a lot of their visions and ambitions, imagine, we be wise to many more things. We work and study at the Mona plantation. Imagine our foreparents looking at us now. But what I found even more interesting, now that I'm an archivist, was the types of records that he used to trace the ambitions and mindsets of the enslaved. Missionary reports, letters, speeches and testimonials that were documented by the blacks themselves. The blacks, made their own speeches and so forth. newspaper reports, and recorded interviews, especially by the abolitionist lobby. Now, I want to stop at the missionary reports. Hopefully I still have time. The missionary reports were reports that were sent by missionaries of particular church denominations to their head office in the UK. And when I was doing my archival training with the university in Scotland, the lecturers at the time was talking about how these missionary reports are kind of pestilence in the profession over there, because there are volumes upon volumes of reports of places nobody really know in Scotland, about peoples and contexts that they don't really know about, but they can't get rid of them. And I remember, but hey, you know, those are valuable to us because they have documented activities and life here in the Caribbean that the regular colonial records, the regular business transactional records did not speak to. And sadly, we can't get them back because the process was you write your report to head office. Once you submit your report, your sustenance, your funding will come. And so even in the UK, there are these missionary reports that speak to how we existed and how we resisted and affirmed our humanity. Woodville Marshall says in this article, blacks had no powerful allies in their quest to take control of their lives. And I don't think people really understand that. And to some extent, it's still the same way. The abolitionists, the politicians, the missionaries, they all shared the staple view that, you know, yeah, we need you to maintain the plantation. You're good for that, nothing more, nothing less, nothing else. And so they never really generally agreed with the desired notions that, you know, blacks had for their own living and future experiences. And so the third point, separate and apart from the work of the, you know, the Europeans, is blacks created and maintained their own records. And a lot of what we consider to be the cultural, you know, activities, the cultural creativity of us, were really their means of creating, talking about, and documenting, and sharing, disseminating, and preserving their own memory, their own details, their own perspectives, their own stories. And so cultural records really were forms, or what Rex Steffon talks about, the cultural equipage. They came with them. And they were the multiple ways of creating and communicating information. And the ways those information, that they, and you know, they informed the ways in which they reconstituted their lived experiences in the Caribbean and affirmed their humanity. So we have oral histories, how they use the landscape, carnivals and festivals, music and instruments, the drum and fife, right? Language and expressions, dress and body movements and adornments, religious beliefs and cosmologies, food and gastronomy, social and family networks, concepts of law and justice, money and saving bank practices, meeting turns, susu, partner, plan, right? Leadership and community, health beliefs and healing practices, you know, right? Bush medicine, use of herbal plants and so forth. And I'm sure I'm missing out some others, funerary and death rituals. We believe the way we say goodbye to our, you know, dearly departed was also a means of reconnecting and documenting and so forth. And so, if you were to take, for example, go back to that image I had in earlier talking about, you know, records coming out of systems and memory and so forth, and we take the example of a family house, typical, all right? Now, we believe everything in the family belongs to us. It's communal. And it's not just what's in the house, but in the yard itself. I remember in a class I said, you know, in some Caribbean cultures, when a child is born, a tree is planted. And a student raised their hand and said, yes, my mother have a breadfruit tree. Think of it. The yard becomes the record-keeping system. The tree is the record of birth. Quite frankly, which is the same thing as a birth certificate, marking the entry of this new life within the space, documenting your presence. The graves in parts of Jamaica and parts of the other parts of the Caribbean, people still go back to the family plot to be buried. Wherever you live in Kingston, they're taking you back to country. And so death becomes part, the record, a part in the archives. So the indigenous communities have been telling us for years, and it's now coming back into the, our consciousness, that the land is the archive and the archive is the land. And if you understood the value of how, what is within the land, we would treat our environment better, right? But, so the land is the archive and the archive is the land. And so the family house becomes this space of creating information, sharing information, the memory, the stories, the meals, the gatherings, the activities, and the tangible artifacts. What's in the house, all have trigger memory, and even the way the houses were built, particularly for me, the veranda was a way of communicating. That's where the storytelling took place. That's where the exchange of ideas, right? And so we think of access then to the information in the archives. The reading room, what we now term as the reading room, chances are will be a veranda. So think of that as systems. Now, I was part of this wonderful project, which was a text commissioned to be included as part of our Masters of Arts in Archives here at Mona. And we argue that it is the creativity of Caribbean people which negates the stagnation of colonial repression. And it is out of our creativity that we create our records. We document ourselves, but chances are we still as a Caribbean don't recognize our culture as information creation and preservation practices. And so the fourth point in terms of resistance is affirming Black humanity by use of colonial records. Pedro Welch is active in the reparations movement that is also on the campus here at Mona. And he shows, by using the records at the National Archives in Barbados, that the survival of government records, plantation records, genealogical records, legal documents, letters, and so forth, serve as evidence to the movement for reparatory justice. And so, against this backdrop, we will continue to find aspects of our social reality through documented historical records. Guy Granum is an archivist in the UK at the National Archives there that was mentioned in the film as under its former name, the Public Record Office. And his call to fame really is, how do you do genealogy, or how do you do family histories through records that were not about families but about transactions? And he says, after emancipation, the further back you go, you're not going to find the traditional family family history sources. You'd have to look at transactional records. That alone speaks volumes. Whatever the slaveholder created in terms of a transactional record, chances are might speak to the enslaved, whether wills, inventories, valuations, receipts, accounts for purchases, mortgages, loans, and personal letters. So in other words, even though those transactional records were not meant to reflect the humanity of the enslaved, the property, today they now, humanize those who were dehumanized and affirmed their Black, humanity. And finally, how can we document our present-day selves, our present-day fight, and the role of Caribbean archives in preserving our Blackness? And we have an image there of one of the cultural traditions in St. Kitts Nevis, the masquerade, which has been linked to what happens in West Africa, and again taking on new meanings as part of the carnival and so forth. Well, last October we celebrated our first graduation, our first cohort, and we had a conference, right? We had a symposium, and in that the symposium was based on the question, how can we unlock Caribbean memory? How can we, unearth new records and discover new archives? And these are some of the papers that came out of that discussion. The use of social media, rethinking carnivals, especially to affirm post-independence narratives and memories, art and art spaces as records and archives, music, new rhythms, memories, and meanings, Caribbean dance, affirming our own records, community archiving projects, AV archives, Caribbean record-keeping standards, and so forth. How we understand our biophysical history. And so even on Facebook, communities, Caribbean people have been documenting themselves using that media. And these are just, you know, screenshots of groups I'm in. There's one there on your right from Belize, genealogical, you know, it's a group on Belizean genealogy. Another one in the middle about St. Kitts Nevis, and the one to my left about the colonial heritage in Jamaica. And they're a very interesting group that you'll find with that one, because you're now getting a sense of families. So people talk about their experiences as children and visiting that plantation house. So they're giving you perspectives that, you know, obviously was based, you know, on particular strata in the society, but still very much a valid perspective nonetheless. There are other examples of, you know, trying to document ourselves. There's the Caribbean Archive Project, the Carnival Archive Project in the UK. There's the Caribbean Photograph Archive in, I think, the USA. And there's this very interesting one called the Caribbean Memory Project out of Trinidad. Again, documenting various aspects of our lives. This one is very interesting, I find, and I've been, you know, a silent observer in the corner there. It's about the Jamaican dancehall, really, and, you know, it's an art form, it's a genre, it's a space that is changed, has changed, is changing, and it's, to my mind, it speaks about the fragility of our present-day memory, because we're doing dancehall, we're doing creativity, we're doing everything, but we're not documenting. Caribbean people really don't document. We're terrible at it. I mean, so my research area initially started off in cultural studies, and I remember trying to get music and lyrics from persons who won a soca competition in Antigua. And the man didn't have it, you know. So we perform, and then that's it, we walk away. And so art form, lyrics, vibes can change without having, you know, any form of real documentation. And so this initiative by Professor Donna Hope really would be of value to future researchers and to future practitioners of the art form. Now, the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020 called for statue removal. And again, as I say, when America sneezes, we catch cold, and that discussion happened here in the region. And so here in Jamaica, they talked about, you know, moving colonial icons, you know, in Trinidad, the Columbus statue. And finally in Barbados, they finally make up their mind as to what they're going to do with Nelson. They've been talking about it back and forth for years. The challenge is, as I said in that thing, really and truly, Vereen Shepherd has argued that the monument is a public archive. And what we see as a monument is really a tangible expression of what we don't see, the records. And, you know, and rightly so, we have been trying to move away from this colonial image and this colonial representation. But to my mind, personally, I don't think it is going far enough by just removing. Because if you notice, the connection between the records and the expressions of memory really hasn't changed. We might look down the statue, yeah, but we have not really validated our own ways of creating information, ways of preserving information, ways of disseminating information as valid. And strangely enough, COVID-19 has allowed us to do that, because the message of shelter at home at the turn of your yard, and the creation of songs and videos and social media memes and so forth. Because for us to understand the seriousness of it, we have to place the details within the context of our traditions. And so I always argue, if you're going to do research on the Caribbean, you have to focus on popular culture, because our traditional archival system was never meant to include those details of the persons from below. So we need to recognize of it. So in addition to licking down monuments, we ought to give financial support to our galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. Really and truly. Our memory institutions are in dire need of resources. History education is something else. We can't really, we have to really make some serious decisions as it relates to how and what we teach as history. The digital transformation of government records and processes, that's happening all over the region without necessarily giving thoughts to preservation. How will we have access to those details? The lack of a timely transfer of records to archival institutions is very strange, but under colonialism and to this day, the records of the UK, in the archives of the UK, they have records about us straight up until the night of independence. Many of us can't boast of having what we are supposed to have in the repository from the point of independence to present. And so we ought to be, we can't cuss England for that because we're independent now. And so we need to ensure that we have, we document ourselves, we validate ourselves, we value ourselves to the point that we are willing to document and preserve ourselves in record forms. We need to reconsider archival theory. A lot of our theoretical standards really don't fit. They were created for the metropolitan, for the temperate climate, and not for our realities. And hopefully our program here in the department is already helping to reshape some of those considerations. And finally, I think one of the major systemic issues is the failure to see archives as culture. Yes, it is governance, yes, it is administration, but we help to shape national constructs of identity. We are proof of who we claim to be and what we are. And so those are some things to consider. So Jeanette Bastian, one of our archival theorists, argues, how can a community reclaim their history? How can the voices that were silent by the colonial records be recovered? How? By having this concept called a living archives. Define what is archival to us. Define what is of enduring value to us. That is already happening. The indigenous communities in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the USA have been affirming that we have records. We have always had records. The totem pole was not just a cultural product. It had meanings. There's history, there's stories, there's personalities, there are events, there are dates in those, constructs. So a firm or a counterpart in the profession in the International Council, they had this thing called the Living Archives Project in the Pacific Ocean area. And the argument was that in that space, what was remembered in the oral tradition predated what is in paper form in the repository. And so for you to really understand the life and people of the Pacific Ocean territories, you need to focus and validate and give appreciation to and aim to preserve the oral tradition. And so the struggle will continue. I want to affirm, though, that whether they are deed books or even dancehall, they are our records, and we ought to see ourselves reflected in our national documentary heritage. Because as Stuart Hall says, those who don't see themselves reflected there are excluded from it. Thank you very much.
Wow. Dr. Griffin, I think after this I'm going to call you an archivist activist, because you've touched on a lot of important areas, and you did exactly what you said you would do. Go to the past, bring it to the present, and then show us the way forward. And I liked that I saw in your presentation one of the student papers that spoke about the Campbell and the riots as a Trinbagonian, and it's very much important to us. And growing up and seeing a resurgence of interest in these things is very important. But the one that stood out to me was looking at social media as archival material, because that 8 minute and how much ever seconds of George Floyd's last moments is a memory that will be forever etched in the, dare I say, the global mind.
Absolutely.
Right? And that has forced some individuals to now look back at other material to say, how long has this thing been going on? Like, how often is this thing happening? Matter of fact, even the autopsy, We had 2 different autopsies. And so when you spoke about contending records, that came to mind, because one autopsy said, you know, he had existing health issues. And another one said,
they broke the man's neck.
Yeah, exactly. You know, the way he was kneeling on his neck, restricted his diaphragm and all of these things. And so I wondered if there is a need to, especially this generation and generations going forward, to further validate social media as archival information in our context. What do you think?
Yes, I think that is definitely the next frontier. Globally, the archival profession has already been thinking about it. I think of several of the universities that have been leading the way in not just the concept in terms of us talking about the value of actually, you know, seeing what we create and what we share in that form as having enduring value, but the technical, you know, nitty-gritties of it.
Yeah.
And, you know, how do we, you know, quote-unquote archive? And there are lots of issues surrounding it, because with social media, you know, people fail to realize social media ain't yours. You're participating in a company, you're placing your server, you're placing a business that after you done share in a server elsewhere and so forth. But at the same time, it is a space where things are discussed, things are shared, things are of personal and communal importance are, you know, stored. And here in Jamaica, we have seen that, you know, especially with politics now, if a politician says something out of the way and somebody remember it, you know, somehow they're able to dig it out of Twitter. And so definitely we have to show, but I think first and foremost, we have to ensure that persons understand that we are part of a continuum. We entered into, in other words, there's a history beyond what is stored on Twitter. And sometimes the more things change, the more they remain the same. You know, when I wasn't initially struck by the George Floyd thing, because we have become so accustomed to these hashtags.
Desensitized.
Right? Because when I actually watch the thing and sit down there 8 minutes, you know, I'm like, good grief. You can't even do pets that.
Yes.
Right? Yes. But again, George Floyd going back all the way to Emmett Till. And as other persons, you know, the hashtag has said, these are names that we know. What about names that we ain't know about? Right? These are things that have been quote unquote documented. What about those that were undocumented?
Yes.
Things that, you know, a man just disappeared.
Yes.
You find him hanging onto some tree. We think of that song by one of those jazz persons, Strange Fruit, hanging in the southern, you know. So it has been happening, and so we ought to see social media as another media. The same way we had paper, same way we have computers, same way we have emails. Now we have Twitter. Before we had Twitter, we had Facebook. Before we had MySpace, we had High Five, right? And so, but at the same time, aspects of our lives are documented there. And we have to ensure somehow that both the creators and the archivists are aware of the values of what we place there.
Before we wrap up, someone said in the comments, Mr. Dawes, that history education must be compulsory for all students at the CSEC level. And I like how that's put, history education, because oftentimes, and even going to school, the history was taught as if it was this objective thing, that this is the only way, right? And I think there is need, as you said, to interrogate this history. There needs to be greater context behind it, the past, the present, and the future, in order for us to truly see the value and not repeat the mistakes. Or as you said, you saw another video, another name, and in our minds it's like, here goes another one. Instead of moving to that point, how do we change this? So yes, so I think your presentation is an excellent start to the what next. We have the names, we have the archives, right? We have access to these things, whether it's our former colonial bosses and even the ones that we've created, and we still have not validated a lot of those, as you mentioned. But the platform is there to show people that our lives truly matter. And so the next step is for collaborations for people like yourself and myself who are in media to not just take the information and store the information, but take this information and change lives.
I keep one of the questions we ask our first year, first semester, first week students is to what extent is archives and the lack of archives, proper archives or access to archives, an influence or an impact on the decline of history. We can't write historians, chances are they may not confess to this, but they need archivists to give them records for them to write history.
Yes.
Same thing for the cultural analysts, same thing for the social scientists. And so we as the archivists, as the archival community, must really make a decision as to what is archival for us. Because if and when we don't supply records, you have nothing to write about. And so it has to be a full societal thing. Everybody has to be, you know, as I said, in terms of history education generally, because chances are we can no longer generalize. If your local national archives is not running properly, chances are you can't have a proper history of your local spaces. And personally, the history of Jamaica is not the history of Grenada. The history of Grenada is not the history. Mind you, Grenada, Jamaica, all of us make quite a fantastic, because we're interconnected.
Yes.
But we are dependent on our own experiences
Yes.
to build on that interconnection.
Yes.
And where there's a weak archives, anywhere in the region, there's a weak Caribbean memory, totally.
Wow.
And so we have to ensure that we document, even in our own families, even in our own personal lives. We have to capture, we have to preserve. And finally, we have to ensure that the value of what we have captured is shared and passed on. When somebody dies, I can tell the story all the while, you know, just to wrap up. When somebody dies, when grandma dies, and people go in the house and start pelt out things, it's not because grandma had rubbish. The value of the things in the house was not passed down.
Yes. Yes.
All those items, that old Bible that was well written up, or that mug, they were kept because they had a particular meaning.
Absolutely.
And the idea with archives is not about storage, but about use. The value of an archive is in its use and not its storage. And so I hope that the series will help, you know, us as a region to really think about how we do memory. What are we, you know, placing at the back of our heads? What are we boxing or capturing or right-clicking and saving? Because really and truly, what we capture and preserve today will be the memory of the future.
And I'm glad we captured this presentation today. So, Dr. Griffin, thank you for your time.
No
Thank you
worries.
for your insight. And ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of the very first presentation of the series, Black Lives Always Matter, looking into historical records in the continued struggle of respecting Black lives locally, regionally, and also globally. And for more information, you can follow the Faculty of Humanities and Education on Instagram at humanities_education_Mona. That's humanities_education_Mona. The next presentation in this series is next Tuesday, August 4 at 2 p.m. And we will be looking at media representation of blackness with yours truly, Steffon Campbell. So this one is one for the books, this one is one for the archives, and one for the records. And I hope that you thoroughly enjoyed this presentation as much as I did. Blessings to all.